I think it's now sort of beyond so many of us, beyond our capacities to describe just how awful things are on the ground.
In terms of when we're responding to Sudan, let's not think of it of what we're going to do next year or the year after. We need to start thinking in decades. We need to think generationally.
We have some countries particularly involved, don't
Absolutely.
we? Like the United Arab Emirates on one side and Egypt on the other.
Yeah, and I think actually it's a bit of a broader coalition now.
Hello again, and welcome to Independent Thinking, the international affairs podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. It's been a busy week here at Chatham House to check out our interview with Mike Pence, Donald Trump's vice president in his first term. And also, I will tell you right at the end of this podcast who has won the Chatham House Prize for 2025. But this week, we are talking about Sudan. The civil war has taken a new and deadly turn. In October, paramilitary rapid support forces captured the western city of Fasher after an 18-month siege in this 2.5-year war with the Sudanese army. Now, credible evidence from reports and satellite imagery suggests that RSF forces are carrying out what has been called ethnic cleansing of indigenous non-Arab communities. But there is also simply a sense that this awful conflict has been pushed out of the headlines in recent years while the world focused on one crisis at a time, whether Gaza, Ukraine, the Israel-Iran war, or so on. Bloodstains on the ground in El Fasher have been photographed from space. The stain on the record of the international community is less visible, but no less damaging. That was UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk last week. With me to discuss the latest developments and the wider regional context and even where this might go are Ahmed Soliman, Senior Research Fellow in our Africa Programme and a researcher on the Horn of Africa, Hubert Kinkoh, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation Academy Fellow here at Chatham House, Kholood Khair, Director of Confluence Advisory, a think tank that works on peace, security, economy and governance, and Bashair Ahmed, a researcher at the University of Sussex with over 20 years' experience working with UN agencies and international organizations on fragile and conflict-affected countries. Well, I couldn't have a better group to discuss this. Ahmed, let me start with you. What is the state of fighting now on the ground?
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast, Bronwen.
It was impossible to not to have you on, Ahmed. You write so much about this for us.
Well, I mean, we're really looking at the most devastating war in Sudan's history. We're now well over 2.5 years into this brutal conflict, which is ostensibly between the Sudanese armed forces and, as you mentioned, the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary force which ultimately stemmed from the former regime, the Bashair era, and was put together through the Sudanese armed forces and the military intelligence, in part to suppress uprising in the Darfur region. But these two warring partners, and now a broader coalition supporting both of them, were responsible for overthrowing a civilian military transition, which started in 2019, first through a coup in 2021, which they participated in together. And then as competition increased between them and the divisions grew, this led to the war starting in April 2023. And now we have a really devastating situation with 2/3 of Sudan's population, well over 30 million people requiring humanitarian assistance. Since the war has started, well over 10 million people have been displaced with...
And I've seen numbers much higher than that. These are huge numbers. You're saying this is one of the worst conflicts in Sudan's history. This is by world standards a terrible conflict.
It's shocking, and globally the worst humanitarian crisis, without a doubt. And now we're at a situation where there has been waxing and waning in terms of the on-the-ground fighting, but a situation has emerged where the army, having retaken earlier this year the capital and many parts of central and eastern Sudan, has control over much of the east and the northeast of the country, including the capital. And the Rapid Support Forces as you said, having taken over recently El Fasher, that was the last capital in North Darfur that they didn't control. So now they have taken over much of the west of the country, and there's still contestation that's ongoing. Now there is, I wouldn't call it a new front, but a lot of people are focusing on the Kordofan region as the kind of epicenter of the current fighting, and resources and troops are being focused in this area.
Hubert, what do we know about the fighting on the ground?
At the moment, the war seems to have entered into a new phase with the recent development, especially in El Fasher. Over the last few weeks, what has been noticeable is the horror in El Fasher that has actually drawn a lot of international attention to the war, underscoring the need to end the fighting. The new developments give the rapid support forces so much control over much of Western Sudan.
You talk to people, you say, every day.
I do. And what comes out from some of the conversations really is that El Fasher is presenting a horrific situation, a horrific picture of the war. And some experts looking at Sudan have compared it to what happened in Rwanda in 1994, showing that what was the Sudanese army's last major stronghold in the wider Darfur region has now given the rapid support forces control over much of Western Sudan. The immediate aftermath of the city's fall has seen a lot of widespread reports of ethnically targeted massacres. There have been mass killings of civilians. There has been reports of rape as well, and mass executions. And the level of violence, like I said, that it has prompted brings comparisons to especially the very first 24 hours of the Rwandan genocide.
Let me go to Kholood. Perhaps you could just take us into a bit the humanitarian situation there. I was watching Channel 4 News last night in pursuit of the clips they made of our Mike Pence event, and was struck when they went from conventional news to they were talking about Sudan, and they said, "We cannot show you the pictures. We cannot show you any of the pictures. They are too bad." What can you tell us about what it is like there?
I think it's now sort of beyond so many of us, beyond our capacities to describe just how awful things are on the ground. I mean, Sudan is the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Sudan is the world's largest displacement crisis. It's the world's largest hunger crisis, and it's the world's largest protection crisis because of the conflict-related sexual violence, which is rampant across the country. And so you have people who have been, for example, displaced not once, not twice, sometimes thrice, sometimes more. You have people who have lost their livelihoods. You have people who don't have access to food. Famine was declared last year. And again, there was famine designation around the same time that El Fasher fell, the end of October, to show that there was severe food insecurity in El Fasher and in other places in the southwesterly Kordofans region. We know that 90% of school children are out of school for several years now, and there are just no educational facilities outside of what is available through mutual aid groups and some NGOs. We know that 70 to 80% of health centers were from the start of the war out of commission, and they continue to be so. So if you're unwell, if you have a chronic disease, if you just want access to sort of everyday medications, all of that is gone. So your life right now in Sudan, particularly those who live closer to the front lines in places like Darfur and the Kordofans, it is very difficult, I think, to describe how desperate it is. And when we speak to people who are on the ground, and you feel bad having to ask them to describe how bad things are for them, but unfortunately, that's the only way to get global attention. It's the only way to feed into humanitarian pathways. But they, describe just the utter helplessness and the utter, an abject inability for them to hold on to anything from their previous lives. Their jobs are gone, their families have gone, they've either died or been displaced, dispersed. And there's no sense of hope about what comes next. There's no sense that there might be turning of the corner, regardless of, what the military dynamics are. And I think that is probably the worst part of it all, that it is such a terrible state of affairs, seemingly without end.
Bashair, how did we get here? This conflict that, at its simplest, started with a disagreement between two groups at the military level, even at the level of two generals, and has spread and spread and spread. Are you surprised that it has reached the extent it has now?
The situation, everyone could see it. Just even being in Khartoum just before the start of the war, you could see it. Everyone was predicting it, but no one could imagine it. And even the response, how it has been after April 2023, is very much geared to, it's wars in the peripheries, but to have the war in the center is something people knew would potentially happen, but no one was prepared for it. And even now, 2.5 years later, everyone, how they're engaging with Sudan and how they're responding to the humanitarian crisis is very much on that basis of on the center. You see it in terms of where you have international organizations and the UN can't access most of the country. Most of the work is being done by mutual aid groups with diaspora. There was an ECO report, Independent Commission on Aid in the UK, that came out a couple of weeks ago, and it was a very damning report in terms of the failures in the UK.
We're going to come on to the more positive and what can be done, and indeed international players. But Hubert, you were going to tell us just a little bit more about what people are telling you from on the ground.
There have been satellite images showing large pools of blood on the streets. There are massive reports as well of mass killings, rape, mass executions going on. We've seen that the displacement also has further been triggered by the RSF's capture of Fasher after an 18-month siege. So the humanitarian operations as well on the ground seem to be on the brink of collapse. And this has evoked a grave concern over the violence escalating even further. And in a nutshell, the reactions that this is spurring from the ground is underscoring the impetus of stopping the war now more than ever.
Ahmed, we've begun to nibble at this question of regional involvement, and other countries are very much involved, aren't they, on either side? Can you just take us into that?
Yes, of course. Well, I think there's no such thing as a national level conflict anymore, and we at Chatham House are doing a lot of work thinking
And
about
particularly your team and the Middle East team on
yeah,
cross-border conflict.
trying to understand the nature of conflict and how it fits in with the evolution of a shifting international order, a much more fragmented world, a world where traditional spheres of influence really can't be relied upon in the same way, and that some of these regional interests are much more, they're not clean, they're not compartmentalized. You find it difficult to understand how they work, and it's a much more kind of network space with these great powers interlinking with the emerging middle powers within the region, and also connecting to the localities when it comes to conflict and different non-state actors. I think when we look at the war in Sudan, certainly it's a regionalized war. Sudan, sits at the confluence of three, well, maybe four actually. You have North Africa, you have the Sahelian region, East Africa and the Horn, and across the Arabian Sea, we have, the Gulf. And really it has influences and is intersected by all of those regions.
We have some countries particularly involved, don't we? Like the United Arab Emirates on one side and Egypt on the other.
Yeah, and I think actually it's a bit of a broader coalition now. So certainly for the Rapid Support Forces, the UAE is the chief, the backer in chief.
And just take us into why they've done that, what their interest is.
I feel sometimes awful saying this, but I think the United Arab Emirates' interests in Sudan go well beyond Sudan. And, there are immediate issues that mean that they think that the RSF is a useful vehicle for their longer term interests in Sudan and the Red Sea. The RSF has provided for them. It is a militia force that they can control through resourcing, funding, providing mercenaries.
How much would you say gold is part of their motivation?
We've done a lot of work on this issue. We've written a report looking at these drivers. I think gold is important, and it's part of the UAE thinking through how it decarbonizes its economy. And this is a longer term strategy for the United Arab Emirates, through which gold and other mineral resources on the African continent in particular are being hoovered up. So it's not just in Sudan, but in Sudan it's important. The interesting thing is that gold is not only coming from RSF areas to the United Arab Emirates. 90% of Sudan's official gold coming from the army-held areas is also going to the United Arab Emirates.
And Kholood, what about the other side, about, say, Egypt's reasons for being involved?
So Egypt has always been a very strong supporter of the Sudanese military. It sees Sudan anyway as an extension of its southern border, and it sees the Sudanese armed forces as the guarantor of that security of its southern border. And it has, the Sudanese army was created very much in the image of the Egyptian army. They have a very common vernacular. It's a century-old relationship even before Sudan became independent. But Egypt's concerns today are mostly about the Nile. It was very perturbed by the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD, being built over the past decade, and then it finally inaugurated this July, and it's concerned about the next dam on the Nile, and it sees Sudan very much as a geographic as well as political buffer between it and Ethiopia. But as Ahmed said, in regards to the broader region, particularly in the Middle East, there's also a coalition forming within Africa. So you have the Sudanese armed forces backed by Egypt, also in alliance with Eritrea and Somalia, and then the RSF sort of in some kind of a looser alliance with the Ethiopians and the Somalilanders in the northern part, the semi-autonomous region in the northern part of Somalia. So you have this region, these cleavages coming out in the region, linked to, I would say, two waterways, not just one. So the Nile is a huge part of it, particularly in terms of Egypt's interest, but the Red Sea is another. And I tend to think of this war as sort of the war of the two waterways, as well as, of course, many other things. But especially here around sea access, Egypt is very much interested in keeping the Red Sea region, on which it depends very much for its economy, particularly the Suez Canal, keeping that as demilitarized as possible. And that means that, wanting to have a security guarantor, in this case, the Sudanese armed forces, that is able to play ball with it. And of course, Sudanese armed forces relies on the support for the Egyptians militarily as well as politically. Since the fall of Fasher, which is a huge turning point, we have seen the Egyptians, and surprisingly, maybe for some, the Turks, come into a closer military alliance that is not just related to the fall of Fasher and the potential changing military landscape in Sudan, but also Turkish and Egyptian interests further afield, in particular in Somalia. So we're seeing Sudan become the fulcrum, really, of these realignments in the region, some of which are quite surprising, I think, to observers. But Egypt here sees itself as the main actor, both in terms of the war as well as then whatever peace may follow.
I think that those are excellent points. And I think, adding just another snippet on the UAE, on the other side to that, you see that this is almost in direct opposition to the Emirati interests. And the Emiratis are also allying closely with Israel. This issue of the Abraham Accords hasn't gone away. And you see
In
that.
what sense?
In that Sudan and the Sudanese army is a country which accepted the Abraham Accords. And so they see Sudan and its position is part of this sphere of influence. There's also a great desire to, on the surface, not see the return of an Islamist regime, which was the case under Omar al-Bashir, but there are some hypocrisies there. So these layers are quite interesting, but it also pits some of the Middle Eastern regional neighbors and allies against each other, which is when we talk about this conflict being quite multi-aligned and compartmentalized.
And tugging in other countries as well. Hubert, what does this do for the African Union's position?
The African Union, understandably, because of the ways in which it has engaged in the conflict in Sudan, has been viewed by a lot of observers as slow to respond. Understandably, it seems as though Sudan represents one of its greatest failures in crisis diplomacy till date. And this is not to suggest that it has not taken important steps so far. Within just days of the conflict, it moved decisively alongside IGAD through the Peace and Security Council. Even at the time, the AU Commission under Moussa Faki issued a lot of statements, but these statements represented a form of declaratory diplomacy without decisiveness. Where they have struggled so far is hard to ignore. The ways in which the African Union has engaged, even in the mediation efforts, seems they have been sidelined, whether it's the Jeddah process or the Quad Initiative or even the Geneva talks before now. The AU seems to have lost its strategic control and leadership. So many people are asking, where is African leadership in this process? And so I think that this presents for the African Union point of reflection. And we understand that they may not have what it takes to move the needle on the conflict at the moment, but the African Union can certainly play a role in supporting the Quad initiative that now seems to be the best initiative that can actually shift the war towards resolution.
So, Kholood, can you just tell us about the Quad initiative and what hopes we might have that it can bring about some kind of resolution?
So the Quad is a formation of countries, the United States, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, who together have charged themselves with finding a resolution.
A self-selecting Quad.
Yes, quite. They came out, there was a sort of a fit of starts, if you will, at the beginning when they sort of started to coalesce over the summer, and they came out with a statement on the 12th of September to say that they were working together effectively to bring about a 3-month humanitarian truce that would be followed by a 9-month cessation of hostilities agreement, after which would follow a political process that would try to find some kind of long-term resolution to this conflict. But there's a huge problem within the Quad, which is that, first of all, at least two of those countries, Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, are actively involved in the fighting. Of course, others are too. And the Saudi relationship with the United States, and we saw this in sharp relief just over the past 24, 48 hours, is one where they're effectively asking Washington, D.C. to referee between them and the United Arab Emirates, quietly, of course. And they're trying to effectively eke out an advantage, a hegemonic advantage in the region. And Sudan now presents a very key and very sort of convenient way to do so. So a lot of the conversations we have seen in and around the Quad that are about Sudan are not actually about Sudan. And this war is very much a globalized war, but it is fundamentally an internal one. And the Quad has absolutely no oversight on the myriad different national level actors that are involved, and certainly absolutely no oversight over the local level drivers of conflict that, when we look at Fasher, when we look at what's happening in many parts of the country right now, are the main motivators behind the violence that we're seeing, are the main sort of engines and vehicles behind what is getting these groups, particularly ethnically aligned groups, to continue to fight, to continue to push against ceasefire efforts, etc. So there's a huge blind spot for the Quad. The other thing is that it's not necessarily the case that the United States wants the same things as these Arab countries want. Certainly, we have seen Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates support the recent spate of coups that Sudan has had. We have seen Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United States push back against genuine efforts to democratize and civilianize Sudan's politics, to the extent to which they're all pushing in the same direction for a commonly shared long-term gain remains debatable.
I want to turn to Bashair. Where do you look for potential progress?
So I'll talk more in the more like in the humanitarian, just a reality, but of where the opportunities are, which is the basics, protection of civilians. This conflict is not a civil war. So the imperative is protection of civilians. And also Sudan is a test case in terms of with the whole humanitarian architecture and development architecture. This is where we can see how we can ensure support for locally led initiatives, because they have been leading the response in Sudan. So, for example, the emergency response rooms, network of more than 20,000 volunteers, they're the ones who have been leading the response on other forms of groups and national organizations, yet they receive less than 1% of international funding. So these kind of like inefficiencies. And in terms of when we're responding to Sudan, let's not think of it of what we're going to do next year or the year after. We need to start thinking in decades. We need to think generationally. So children who are under 10 are going to have no memory of a stable country.
That is a really important point. And let me just pick up one interesting thing you said in passing. You said this is not a civil war. Why do you describe it that way?
It's not a civil war because it's different warring parties. It's not the civilians who are fighting each other.
I think it's an absolutely crucial point, yes.
Yeah, so in terms of how we're framing it, everyone thinks, oh, it's another civil war. No, it's not.
So it is two groups which control different parts of the country, but that's not rooted in what the civilians think.
No. So when people assume that, however, the impact of it does have massive impact on the civilians in terms of death, the level of displacement, forgotten futures, those who are displaced in country, also in neighboring countries. So the number is probably closer to 13 million out of almost 50 million people. So that's not a small number. It's devastating, and it will stay with people for generations. And people will remember who stepped up to support them at their hour of need.
Absolutely. And you mentioned what the grassroots aid groups like the emergency response rooms are doing. What about international aid from Africa, from the wider world? Is that managing to get in?
Very little in terms of there's limited access. So, for example, the United Nations World Food Programme, the first time they were able to enter the capital was last year in December. So nearly 2 years later after the war. It's quite telling. In many parts of the country, they just don't have the access. So they're working with these mutual aid groups, or they're the ones who are taking that leadership. Yet they receive most of the funding. I think it's about less than 4% of it goes to national organizations. So no one is investing in Sudanese civil-led entities or these mutual aid groups who are essentially been taking the responsibility for their communities, because they're not outside of it, they are part of it.
Well, thank you for that. Ahmed, as we draw to a close on this perhaps you can just pull it together for us. And what hope do you place in the Quad or other mechanisms that might bring some resolution to this?
Well, as Hubert said earlier, and maybe Kholood also reminded us of the nature of the Quad, I think it's the best we have at the moment. Even, a broad group of Sudanese civilians are putting their weight behind it. We have to be clear that actually, even in terms of the US's interest and the various interests of the other Arab members of the Quad, it is very limited. So it is looking for a humanitarian truce, it is looking for a ceasefire, but I don't think that the US is very interested in a political process or being part of that. We're talking about high-level diplomacy.
Which, as you said, has many other factors
Yeah.
going on, including ones that are just within the Middle East itself.
Yeah. So my worry at the moment is that there's no thinking systematically about what comes next. Even if we are able to get to a situation where the Quad can produce a ceasefire, we need a political process. We need levers around humanitarian access and protection of civilians. Those things are not aligning. And frankly, those partners do not seem to be that interested in connecting to the political process. We have a wider international sphere. We have the UK, we have the EU, who are all trying to support efforts in some form or another to build and to support a political process, but it's not coming together. This is the really critical element that would come after, and some might say even in parallel to these Quad talks and the ability to reach a ceasefire. But amplifying the role of civilians, Sudanese civilians, has to be the long-term goal. I was really struck by what Bashair was saying there. Thinking, acting long-term now. This is the crucial element. And trying to bring together a cohesive political process that includes African agency, African
But
structures.
includes both warring groups.
I mean, we're talking about the ceasefire, and then we're talking about, I think, something separate when it comes to the civilian political process that really, ultimately has to come together in terms of the governing arrangements moving forward. They're not, obviously, the warring groups are not going to willingly cede power, but there have to be mechanisms, there has to be discussions around what can be done to transition to a civilian government in the future, and that requires an inclusive and cohesive political process that is multi-layered and really has support from, I think, and I would advocate, like-minded countries such as the UK, European Union, Canada, Norway, and others coming together to help boost this initiative. Because ultimately, we talk about US aid cuts, we talk about less US interests, apart from the high level. There needs to be support and resourcing towards this in the longer term.
It's a really important point about what other countries can do, because we know where the US's attention very much is on the agreement it did manage to get at the UN Security Council on Gaza and indeed on its attention on Ukraine at the moment. We are going to have to stop there on that, but not quite, because I said at the beginning I was going to tell you who had won the Chatham House Prize. And I'm delighted to say that it is indeed the emergency response rooms, that is Sudan's grassroots aid groups. And this is an annual honour awarded to the person or persons or organisation which the members of Chatham House vote on and decide has made the most significant contribution to the improvement of international relations in the previous year. And as Bashair was saying, the emergency response rooms are recognised explicitly in this prize for their crucial role in delivering humanitarian aid during this conflict. They have saved lives in areas often inaccessible to others. They step in where state structures are broken down, and they provide essentials like food, water, and medical supplies, and maintain or repair power and water systems. We put out a statement explaining this and the reasoning for this prize, why members have voted for this year. So do look that up. The prize is now going to be officially announced today, and a special event will take place next year at which representatives of the emergency response rooms will be presented with the award and a scroll signed by His Majesty the King, who is patron of Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. With that, I'm going to have to leave you. Huge thanks to my guests. We'll see you next week.